And I think it
Hi,
has.
everybody. Yeah, we are ready to go, I think. And I wanted to first introduce our guest speaker, who is Michael Brown, the Executive Director of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. We're recording this program because Mr. Brown was not available on Monday night. But if you have questions for him, please be sure and keep track of them, and I'll make sure that we get those to him. Michael, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Rowena. And first of all, I want to say this program is a little bit about a early Jewish community in Indiana, how they got to the state, how they got to places such as Bedford, even though there wasn't a Jewish community there that was founded, but why you find individuals in many of Indiana's small towns, and what are some of the common misconceptions of Jewish communities in Indiana and its early history. So first of all, I want to kind of address some of the misconceptions. So the first misconception is that people have, they identify Jews with being primarily urban, which is a fairly recent event, given that early in our state history, it was quite common to find Jews in smaller towns or mid-sized cities all over Indiana. And we'll find out really from the Ohio River all the way north of the St. Joseph, all the way up to Lake Michigan. You could find Jewish communities in small towns. The other myth that I would say is that that these early Jewish settlers were almost exclusively Reformed. That's not really true either. You do have some Jewish traditionalists and even some Orthodox Jews who were in this community of early Jewish immigrants. And I'd say probably the third is that just the idea that Jewish communities that you really have just one state Jewish identity. In Indiana, we're unique in that each region of Indiana kind of has its own nature. So there's Michiana, there's Kentuckiana, there's Iliana, and so it makes it very complex studying Indiana as a cohesive Jewish community, because we have so many regions in our state that have their own unique subcultures. And so many of these early Jewish pioneers went to places on the Ohio River, such as Evansville and Madison, we'll learn later on. And another thing that you'll find about this program is that really Indiana was sort of a laboratory of what we would call early Reform Judaism or early Judaism really in America. So let's jump in here. And what do I mean when I'm talking about Germanic Jews? Why don't I just call them German Jews, for example? So the first question is, who are Ashkenazim? So Ashkenazim, which is the group that we're talking about today, comes from the biblical name, which is Ashkenaz, which is Hebrew for Germania. So that's the origin of the word Ashkenazim. It's widely believed that Ashkenazim are descended from slaves and captured Jewish combatants after the failure of the Roman revolts, who were moved to the edges of the Roman Empire. Some theorize that Ashkenazim are genetically traced to 4 women who lived on the Rhine of what's Germany today. And the other thing is that I want to say is that Germany didn't really come into existence until the 1880s. So that's why I'm using the term Germanic or German speaking, because all of these different groups, whether they were Jews or non-Jews, were called Bavarians or Prussians, because they, or let's say Alsatians, because we're talking about the regions that they came from that now today make up Germany. So imagine Germany was a group of kingdoms, principalities in different states until the 1880s. So there was no Germany when many of these early Jewish pioneers came to America. And if your family came from any sort of German-speaking background, they also didn't come from what was called Germany until the 1880s. So we're looking at what distinctively makes German-speaking Jews German-speaking Jews. So if we look at some of the liturgy, some of it was influenced by the murderous attacks of the Crusaders, for example. And there was a real love by German-speaking Jews of synagogue choirs. And another feature is that German-speaking Jews also descended, had a great love of the Jews of Spain. So they modeled their synagogues off of the synagogues of Spain before the Spanish Inquisition, and they took a different Sephardic Jewish customs from Spain, such as having our bar mitzvah for boys, and giving them what's called a talit. If you've ever seen the garment that has the 4 fringes on it, that typically wasn't given to all Ashkenazim until they were married. So they were taking up the customs of Sephardim, some of the customs, and they had this unique culture all their own that was different from Eastern Ashkenazim or Yiddish-speaking Jews who had their own distinct customs, who would come to America later in different waves of immigration. But today we're focusing on the German-speaking Jewish community that primarily came to Indiana first and established some of the first Jewish communities in Indiana. So we're looking at what is the Germanic period of Indiana Jewish history. So historians generally break up American Jewish history into 3 phases of immigration. So the first phase is the Sephardic phase. I already talked about the Jews who came from the Spanish exile. These Jews went to Recife, which was a Dutch colony. That colony was conquered. They then came to New York. And then from New York, they formed a Jewish community there called Sheret Israel. The congregation is still there. And that really marked the beginning of the first era of Jewish migration from Sephardic lands. The second is, in what we're going to be talking about today, is the German-speaking Jewish immigration that it begins in the 1920s, but it really doesn't pick up until the 1840s. We'll explain why, and ends in the 1880s. And the last, most prominent phase of American Jewish immigration started in the 1880s and lasted in the 1920s. And again, these were the Jews from more of Eastern Europe who spoke Yiddish, and some speaking Ladino from Turkey and the Middle East. But by far the biggest migration were Yiddish-speaking Jews from places like Russia, Poland, Romania, and other parts of Eastern Europe. So the next slide that we'll go to is just the idea of the normality of being rural for Germanic Jewish communities. So one thing that a lot of people don't understand is that in Germany itself, it was quite common to see small families and individuals living in these small rural German communities and maybe tiny Jewish communities dotting all over the German-speaking lands. And this wasn't uncommon. It wasn't uncommon to find 1 or 2 families living by themselves in a predominantly non-Jewish place in Germany. This was not odd or strange at all. We would find this, to be quite surprising today, but it was completely the norm. And so coming to Indiana, it wasn't strange for them to resume living in a community that was vastly, mostly non-Jewish, because that was already the world they were living in. It wasn't some type of adjustment for them. And so that trend continued in the 19th century. when you start seeing German-speaking Jews settling in small Midwestern towns, including places in Indiana like Madison, Wabash, LaPorte, and Ligonier. And another thing that a lot of people don't realize is that many Jews in the German-speaking lands were already peddlers there, although peddling in the age of industrialization became much harder and cumbersome in Europe. So many of the Jews who were coming to America had already taken up peddling in Europe. And so they were more or less just transferring the things that they had learned in Europe to their own American experience. And one of the other factors, I would say basically you have, and we'll get into the different factors of push versus pull factors of why Jews came to Indiana. And then looking at this, I'll go through a retrospective. So basically, the three major movements of Judaism in America all have origins in the German-speaking world, that being the Reform, the Conservative, and Orthodox Judaism. None of them actually started in America, although they really grew in America, we'll find out in this program. They all actually have their origin in the Reform movement starting in Hamburg in 1818, and the Conservative movement starting in Breslau, which is the centrist movement between Orthodoxy, and even the predecessor to what we'd call modern Orthodoxy today was also started in what would become Germany. So these are really German-speaking Jewish phenomena that are transplanted into the Americas and become an important part of the American Jewish experience. And so what exactly was a synagogue in the 19th century? Because that's a big part of our program today, is opening up these congregations. So a congregation, a synagogue, in those days was different than what we think of a synagogue today or a temple today. It was a house of prayer, it was a house of meeting, and a house of learning, but it was also a place where you could find a ritual circumciser, called a moil in Hebrew, Jewish religious education for your children, which you can still receive at a synagogue, and kosher meat, a kosher butcher. So you see in this primary source right here, a letter from Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1862 during the Civil War. It's a help wanted ad looking for someone that could be a moil, a shochet, and a chazan. So someone who could lead prayer services, someone who could do ritual slaughter, kosher slaughter, very important for Jewish communities that could only eat kosher meat. According to Orthodoxy and traditional Judaism, keeping kosher was really important. And a moil, a ritual circumciser, which is really important to Judaism. And then that person had to be capable of teaching in both German and the Hebrew languages, and would get a salary of $400 prerequisite, or $200 per annum. So they were expecting a lot in Fort Wayne of their potential religious leaders. And bear in mind, at this time, America wasn't producing rabbis yet. There were rabbis coming in from Europe, but America didn't have a place to educate rabbis. So many of these were kind of lay leaders that would call themselves ministers, and they would have specific Jewish skills that communities would need, such as leading prayers or a ritual slaughter or a moil, or all three in this case. And then looking at this, really one of the biggest differences between the Russian, the Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jewish migration and the German-speaking Jewish migration was that at the same time many German-speaking Jews were coming to America, 150,000, 200,000 or so Jews. And again, the Jewish community was really growing. In 1840, for context, there were only 15,000 Jews in all of America. And by 1860, by the beginning of the Civil War, it was 150,000. And so what was going on was, it wasn't only Jews who were coming from Europe, it was many, many, many other German speakers, Catholics and Protestants as well, who were moving to the Midwest, a place similar temperature. Probably many of your relatives, if they come from German-speaking lands, also came to Indiana around the same time, or to other Midwestern cities. And so there were two big push and pull factors. Everything in immigration has a push or a pull factor. So, and historians argue about this a lot. What was bigger? Was it the push factors like anti-Semitism or laws restricting who could get married in places like Bavaria, or was it more of the pull factors, which many economic historians and Jewish studies professors allude to, which is, the economic opportunities, the possibility of entrepreneurship, and making on your own, becoming, having the potential to be in a society where you're instantly emancipated once you became an American citizen, and you were no longer sort of a second-class citizen in some of these other places like Bavaria. And many of the other non-Jews were very progressive German speakers who were fanning out all over the Midwest because they were kind of just sick of the status quo in Europe. They saw Europe as sort of still in kind of a dark age and wasn't progressing. So that leads us to a very, very important date and I really feel like it's really important for American history too, which is 1848, which is when a lot of European revolutions kicked off. And a lot of Europeans wanted to remove the old order of European inequality and serfdom. Many Jews were involved in German-speaking lands. These revolutions failed, and many Central Europeans, both Jewish and non-Jews alike, were very disappointed that the revolutions didn't change Europe, it didn't end the serfdom and inequality there. So many of them came to America, and these were called the 48ers, and they fanned out all over the Midwest and even out into California into the gold rush of 1849. And we can kind of look at some of the different groups that were coming from German-speaking Jews settled in Indiana, kind of representing each region of the German-speaking world of what would become Germany and Austria. So you have Bavarians, Alsatians who also speak French. And by the way, this group, the Alsatians, were quite used to praying at home. They were primarily farmers, unlike many of them were farmers, unlike the Bavarians, many of them were peddlers and merchants. And they were able to buy land because they'd already been emancipated because they were part of France, not part of what would become Germany later. So they had already been emancipated before coming to America. And many of them came to the Midwest and to the American South. So we're going down to here. And so basically another major factor when it came to Jewish communities coming to Indiana was transportation. And one thing that I don't list here, but it's a big factor, was steam engines. So steam engines, the beginning of steamships was it really cut down the amount of time that you were going over the Atlantic Ocean, because it was a terrible, awful voyage if you had to go on a regular ship. Awful, terrible voyage. But with steamships, that made the trip much faster. And the other change that we can look at in the mid-19th century was the Erie Canal. That was a big game changer. And so with the Erie Canal, you had then transportation to major hubs like Fort Wayne, Evansville, Lafayette, Madison. And those places that were on navigable rivers became really, really important to trade. So that's why you have some of your earliest Jewish communities formed in the 1840s in these cities built on major rivers. Madison actually being the biggest city in Indiana at one time, being bigger than Indianapolis at that time. And then the next factor that came a decade later was really the railroad coming through. And this really started and sparked Jewish communities in Indianapolis, Ligonier, LaPorte, and Marion, Indiana. And this really picked up during the industrial boom during the Civil War. And so you can start to see that outpaces the southern half of Indiana, where at first, initially, you see many Jewish communities start, but after the Civil War, there's a push to move further north and industrialize the northern part of the state. And so just a couple of the different peddlers I was talking about, the Jewish peddlers that would come to Indiana, they would have their own specific regions. And these peddlers would go to small towns, in this case, Ligonier, Indiana. And there were two competing peddlers that continued building up their businesses. And first they went into peddling, then they had small stores, and then they went into finance, and became quite influential there as merchants in Ligonier. And then there's one big, I would say the biggest protagonist of 19th century American Jewish history, and I'd be remiss to not mention him, would be Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who had this big vision of uniting all these different factions. We are talking about all these different ethnic groups, all these different sub-ethnic groups, because really you couldn't, because each one of these different regions of Germany, Jews had their own traditions. And so putting them all together was kind of unwieldy. And Isaac Mayer Wise determined that the best way forward to have a pioneering Judaism was to more or less break down those differences and create one central Jewish community, one central Judaism with one prayer book. So you would step into a synagogue and you would see many different types of prayer books. He wanted one prayer book and one standard of Judaism. And he had two newspapers, one in German, Die Deborah, and one in English called The American Israelite. And he used both these newspapers to push his ideas out to create a uniform Judaism. And this other push was to start building synagogues. So you saw him go out, span all the way out through Indiana, building synagogues, whether it was in Evansville, Indiana, or Ligonier, or Lafayette, or Indianapolis twice. He would come out to these cities and push to start synagogues or temples that would be in his mode. And his prayer book was called Minhag America, or the traditions or customs of America. And he wanted this prayer book to be in every synagogue. And so he had a big struggle against local Jewish communities that didn't adapt to what he thought would be the best for pioneering Judaism in the mid-19th century. And we'll come back to other reasons why he's really important to both Midwestern Judaism and beyond. So looking a little bit further on, we get to Fort Wayne's Jewish community, where they found the first synagogue in Indiana in 1848. And what's interesting about this year is that the first synagogue in Brooklyn, New York, wasn't formed until 1848. So the first synagogue in Indiana was actually formed the first year as the first synagogue in Brooklyn, New York. Go figure. And so we have these three figures from the Nerdlinger family. And the Nerdlinger family were major merchants. They opened up the New York store and they became city council members. And they formed an organization called the Koheg, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounced this, the Kohanga Guards. And that name actually later on became his son's baseball team's name. So his son started one of the first Major League Baseball teams in Fort Wayne and played under that name, becoming one of the first Major League Baseball teams in the country in Fort Wayne. But so the Nerdlingers, when they created the synagogue, the way that a synagogue, if I was to create sort of a cycle of how synagogues began, synagogues normally are created when someone dies, not in all cases, but they need to create a cemetery committee. And then out of that cemetery committee, other needs are met. So people are born, so you need a mohel, a ritual circumciser. And then other things become important. So marriages, you need someone to be a representative there. You need kosher slaughter if you have people who keep kosher there. You need someone to educate the children. That's obviously really, really important. So a lot of these synagogues, when there weren't public schools, actually became the full-time schools of the children. So they learned Hebrew and German and English, and this was their full-time school. This wasn't just like a Sunday school. This was their full-time school because there wasn't a public school in places like Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. And really, almost like kind of like a Catholic community, you have services that are cradle to grave. It was a mutual aid society. So really, everything you needed from the time you were born to the time you died, you could find in this Jewish community at Congregation Akdu Shalom, as it became known later. And so this is the Nerdlingers' home. And I'll scroll down a little bit into here. This is actually their second, they actually purchased a church for their second synagogue. And at this point, even in the late 1850s, they started to become more and more reform in the mode of like Isaac Mayer Wise, or maybe even more radically reformed than him. And then if we go down, we can look at kind of their aesthetic pieces of how they would design their synagogue. So we can see in Fort Wayne, this building that we see in Fürth, which is in Bavaria, and we see the very Gothic-looking synagogue that was built in Fort Wayne, which was their third synagogue that they built. So you can see that they really pride themselves on their pattern, their design choices, even on where they came from in Fürth in Bavaria. Here's another picture and it was built in 1876, and absolutely beautiful synagogue. It was demolished, unfortunately. And here's the third view of the same synagogue in Fort Wayne. And then we'll go down to Lafayette really quickly. So Lafayette was established when another two peddlers came together, and they started a relationship through marriage. And the two brother-in-laws ended up forming one of the largest baking businesses in America. When they established Cohn, Loeb and Company in 1849, between Abraham Cohn and between Abraham Cohn and Max Cohn and Abraham Cohn, Abraham Loeb, sorry. Those two formed perhaps one of the largest banking empires in American history. later purchased by Lehman Brothers in the late 70s, and we know what happened to Lehman Brothers. But what's also remarkable about the synagogue in Lafayette, again, a city on a river, formed in 1849, see that year, 1 year after the revolutions, many immigrants coming, many German-speaking Jewish immigrants who are coming. They form what's called Ahavas Achim, which is brotherly love. And again, this is also a synagogue that started as a result of a death. They had to form a burial committee that eventually became a synagogue. And this synagogue was built in 1867. Before this synagogue was built, they actually had services above a gun shop. And one of the other unique things about this congregation, Ahavas Achim, is that this is probably the first place that egalitarian Jewish prayer occurred in America, meaning that women and men could sit side by side, but women could count, they could pray, they could do everything that men could do in a prayer quorum, creating equality between the sexes, which was virtually unheard of in Jewish services in the mid-19th century, let alone even in the early 20th century. So this is a really, really, really special case that occurred in this temple, in this synagogue. And you can see a little bit of the interior. Synagogue actually still exists. The building still exists. And you can actually compare that to another synagogue that was built in Germany in 1910. It has a really distinct, and I'm going to totally apologize for my German, Rundbogenstil. It's a round arch style, and the original location was this is the original location of Ahavat Achim. So yeah, so you can really see the similarities there. There's also another synagogue in Madison, Wisconsin, that looks very, very similar. But in Germany, you can actually find many examples of this style used for synagogues. You can also find railway stations. It's not exclusively a Jewish architectural style. And then I'll go a little bit into Evansville's, how Evansville's synagogue was built. So Evansville's first purposely built synagogue in Indiana was built in 1865, and you can see a picture of it here. And also the first Jewish family that permanently settled in Indiana that we know of was the Gumberts, who came to Evansville, Indiana in 1837 from the Rhineland. And that family donated the land for that first temple to be built. Now, the difference between Evansville's Jewish community and the other two examples that we already talked about, Lafayette and Fort Wayne, was that they started, instead of starting out as someone dying and then starting a cemetery committee, they just started as an unofficial minyan, a prayer quorum in 1850. So they started a little bit differently than the other two congregations we talked about earlier. And just to give you an idea of, back to Isaac Mayer Wise, he writes them in Die Deborah, his German newspaper, reminding them, because he was very upset before they had adapted Minhag America. And then he really, really was happy that they adapted it after he visited their synagogue, after they had opened it. And here's a whole article he wrote about it, that he's talking about for the sake of unity and peace in the Jewish community. He was very strident pushing for this. It was almost obsessive on his part. And so here we have one of the early rabbis of Evansville, Indiana. He was also an early rabbi in LaPorte, Indiana. And his name was Max Del Banco. His family was from Hamburg. And Max really had this, he was really part of a victim of this Jewish political push and pull. So you had another newspaper in Philadelphia called the Occident that represented the more traditional perspective on Judaism in America, written by Isaac Leeser. And Isaac Leeser actually came to open Akdu Shalom in Fort Wayne when they were more traditional. So Isaac Mayer Wise, of course, was an opponent. And so their newspapers sparred back and forth, and both of them sort of belittled this poor rabbi, Max Delbanco, that was sort of used as a political football back and forth, debating whether he was too reform or too orthodox. And so it was going back and forth between the two. And eventually, he said, speaking in his own voice, he said Delbanco fired back in the pages, saying that he was mildly a reformist Israelite was his answer. And his community, he said, in Evansville was by no means Orthodox. So Max Delbanco served there until 1864. He left the congregation to go to Vicksburg, Mississippi, to work with the soldiers. And sadly, he actually died in a steamship fire. His steamship caught on fire, and he died at the end of the Civil War in that explosion on a steamboat when he was returning from conducting high holiday services for the Union forces in 1864. So he was lost at sea. And so the Evansville Jewish community had another significant achievement, was that they also call it the Washington Avenue Temple. It was one of the first members of the Reform Movement's Union of Hebrew Congregations that started in 1873. And the third congregation, the congregation was officially called B'nai Israel. And the third congregation to join in August of 1873 was the Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation. And so I'll scroll down here. So one of the biggest things to happen in Indiana, Jewishly, one of the biggest, I would say, in my opinion, one of the biggest things that ever happened, come out of Indiana from a Jewish perspective, was when a Orthodox Jewish merchant by the name of Henry Adler, who was in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, he was born in Alsace-Lorraine, invested $10,000. He was not a wealthy person. He was maybe middle, you could say he was maybe middle class. And he gave that money to Isaac Mayer Wise to start a rabbinical school, the first rabbinical school in American history, called the Hebrew Union College, to professionalize the rabbinical career. So before this, you didn't have professional rabbis. You had sort of these kind of reverends that were sort of unofficially trained. Some of them had questionable qualifications. Some of them really had no qualifications. Some of them were kind of quacks. So really, this set out to professionalize the rabbinic career. And the first graduate, the first official graduate from the first class at Hebrew Union College was this fellow, Israel Aaron, who would become the rabbi of the first congregation, Jewish congregation in Indiana, Akdu Shalom, in 1883. So this is fascinating. The first synagogue in Indiana received the first ever graduate of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1883, and the first rabbi ever to be ordained in America that we know of served as a rabbi at Temple Octave Shalom, Congregation Octave Shalom in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so one last little Jewish community I want to focus on in southern Indiana is Madison, Indiana. And I think it's a really, really fascinating Jewish community and very unique, in my opinion. So in the starting in 1850s, and this wasn't uncommon, they actually started their synagogue on the second floor. And the synagogue doesn't have to be a building. It could be inside of a store or a shop. Many times it was on the second floor of a men's store that was owned by a Jewish family, Marks and Benson store. And we'll get to see a few pictures of what it looked like inside of the synagogue in Madison. And, you know, it's pretty remarkable considering the reputation of Madison was called the Porkopolis. So inside of the synagogue, you have a ritual bath in the basement that women would use to immerse during certain times of the month during menstruation. And so this is the oldest mikvah, the oldest ritual bath that we know of in Indiana that was built in the 1850s. And it's also an indication that they were, many of them were practicing Orthodox Judaism. And here's actually a picture next to Elizabeth Weinberg, who took the picture of what the doorway, the massive door, looked like to the synagogue in the upstairs. Now, this is a fascinating character, Gottfried Levi. He was the 1850s Madison, Indiana's Jewish community leader. He was a merchant trading cigars. Came from a very wealthy, very well-to-do family, and he was also the great uncle of Justice Louis Dembitz Brandeis, who was the Brandeis being the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And he left a last will and testimony in German bemoaning the fact that his family no longer followed the tenets of what's called Sabbatianism, or the belief that a fellow from the Middle Ages named Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah. But he was the only person who really believed in that. So this is a really, strange case of that happening. It's very you can consider that an anomaly in American Jewish history, because he's really the only person, one of the few people who really believed that and left a last will testimony bemoaning that his family no longer was following the tenets of Sabbatianism, or belief that Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah. Shabbatai Tzvi, by the way, he actually ended up converting to Islam. He was forced to convert to Islam, and some of his followers continued following Sabbatianism afterwards, but most of them fell off of Sabbatianism at that point. And there is another important development from Madison, Indiana, was one of their early rabbis, Rabbi Felsenthal, who received his rabbinic ordination in what would become Germany. He was considered what was called radical reform, meaning that he questioned the length of the services. He was okay with modifying things even further than Isaac Mayer Wise wanted to go in terms of Judaism, and changing or eliminating parts of Jewish law. And his own prayer book that he worked on was actually a competitor to Isaac Mayer Wise's Minhag America. Oh no. And so they had a real beef between each other, him and Isaac Mayer Wise. He was also an ardent abolitionist. He was very he took a very strong and public stance against slavery. He refused to work at pulpits in states that supported slavery, and he had a falling out with the local Jewish community that thought that he was too radically, he was too much on the radical side of the Reform movement. But he ended up becoming really one of the founders of Reform Judaism in Chicago, and still remained very influential in the Reform movement. Lived a very long life. And this was actually their building that was converted into a synagogue that they used later on in 1868. So this is a story about Isaac Mayer Wise talking about how much he loved Indianapolis. And here's what the Minhag America looked like, if you're wondering, right here. So I'll go down a little bit through Indianapolis. And so the last community I'll talk about is Indianapolis. And so Indianapolis during the Civil War actually had a Jewish Civil War general, a real hero named General Friedrich Niesler, who helped build the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And Senator Morton, who was previously the governor of Indiana, was actually at the opening of the synagogue's opening in 1868. And they built this just absolutely magnificent synagogue in Indianapolis. And this is Rabbi Meir Messing, who also he came from Prussia. Interesting story about how he found out about the congregation. I'll leave you on this vignette. So he discovered the congregation. He came from a long line of rabbis. In fact, all of his brothers ended up becoming rabbis in America, and in Iowa, Chicago, San Francisco. And he ended up finding out about an opening in Indianapolis from the Deborah, Isaac Mayer Wise's newspaper that was somehow in circulation in Prussia. He was in the Franco-Prussian War, and he was wounded. And he saw an ad for the Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation. He saw an ad like one of the ads we saw above that was looking to hire a rabbi. And he answered the call. He went all the way out to Indianapolis and he interviewed for the job, and he got it. And he became really the first celebrity rabbi, I would say, in Indiana's history. He was the rabbi who presided over many marriages. He was founder of the Indiana Humane Society. Just a wonderful person. And each one of his daughters also was very influential. One of his daughters was a leader in the abolitionist movement. Another one of his daughters was the first female consulate member. She was a head of a consulate in Weimar, Germany before World War II. And another one of his daughters was a leader of a national Jewish organization, Hadassah. And another one of his daughters was also a vaudeville star. So all of his daughters were very accomplished, and his brothers were all well-known rabbis. So just an absolutely brilliant family, the Messings. And so I want to give you a few glimpses of really he persuaded over 2 synagogues being built. So the other one that I showed you previously, and then this one that I'll show you here, maybe this is familiar to you. And this is actually kind of a rarity to have an iconic image inside of a synagogue. But even more rare that you actually see the horns coming out of the heads of Moses, which is actually based on a mistranslation of the Hebrew text. So it was actually rays of light and not horns, but based on the mistranslation. So this beautiful stained glass that was made was very controversial, and they ended up deciding to actually put it in the 1899 synagogue. It's actually still in Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation in one of their windows there. And so that's one of the unique features, and you can see this very, very large organ, magnificent building. Unfortunately, it burned down in the 1970s, and it was one of the last synagogues, if you're wondering, that Rabbi Isaac Mayer Weiss, who would soon die, visited right when it opened in 1899. So that concludes our program today. Again, if you're interested, if you have questions about this program, michael.brown@ijhs.org. Again, that's michael.brown@ijhs.org. If you have any questions, please let me know. Love to hear from you, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Michael. That was excellent, really interesting. I know this information will be new to a lot of our members because it was really new to me. So appreciate it. And
Do you have any
yeah, I'll let
questions
you
before we
know.
go?
Well, probably, but I wasn't writing them down. Like some of them answered themselves. Like I was like, what is IHC? And then I realized it's Indiana Hebrew Congregation, right? Or something like that.
Correct, 100%, yeah.
Oh, excellent. Okay, because that's what I concluded based on something else you said later. Let me think what I didn't write them down, so I might have to. I'll watch this all over again on Monday with our group, and I'll write a few down for you then. How's that?
That'd be great. Happy to answer them, and I could do a follow-up where I just answer questions for you too, and I'd be happy to record that for you if you'd like.
Yeah, let's see what questions we get, but I really appreciate your making yourself available, and we'll show this on Monday, and then it'll go up on our YouTube channel at some point after. Okay, thanks so much.
Sure. Thank you, Rowena. Thank you for having me. I really, really appreciate it. Great honor.
Thank you, and thank you, John Bush, if you're still on here someplace, for helping us make this possible.